Okay, so this won't be about how to shade, but this is going to be about color choices and shading. And I'm using this old drawing as a sort of a guinea pig, a lab rat, if you will, because I've reshaded it in several different varying ways to give more of a varied and dynamic example of what I'm talking about. So let me get rid of this background just to show you how much this creature pops out in comparison to the just a plain white background and how dark some of these colors actually are. And whenever you put one color next to another, which is basically the entirety, the in essence what picking certain color palettes is all about, what color theory is all about, that actually sort of creates in your mind a composite color, which you can put something very green next to something very purple, and in combination it could seem as though like the shading can recontextualize the color of the character. But let me remove that shading so that I can get you to the base color, which is incredibly bright, but it's more or less balanced. It's very kind of greenish. Like, let me see here. Let me get these little boxes open. This is a very, very somewhat greenish sort of color palette here. Nothing's like completely white. This is more of like a greenish white. This one is, I mean, it's riddled with a lot of like cooler colors, from like ranging from like greenish to like, if you can see on the color wheel, this is definitely like a light greenish, sort of like middle, leaning way more towards blue. Then you go down here to this particular shade of like pinkish red that's on the opposite end, which complements it a little bit. You have this blue right here that's sort of in this middle area between almost being turquoise and almost being just like a cyan blue or some shit. I don't know. Now this range of skin goes more towards like the yellow. That red's also very pinkish. This is very close to white, but it's still just somewhat off. It's sort of a bluish greenish white. You get the idea. Most of these fit within a complementary realm to one another. Even this dark like grayish black is still like that is still steeped within like a cooler range of colors. So everything pretty much fit within this area of the color wheel right here. You know, it didn't like transverse too much around this area, and even if it did, I try to make sure it was complementing one side over the other, so that it was all for the most part balanced out. But a lot of this ends up looking this way, the base color, if you go into the hue and saturation and start messing with things just to give yourself more depth of color, because the range ends up going from like this to this all of a sudden. And granted, there is technically a lot more color involved here because of, let me see, what's going on there? There's technically a lot more color involved based on the fact, there you go. There's definitely a lot more color involved here based on the fact that I was using a brush that was a bit more watercolory, but for the most part, just based on the basic shading palette, you have this greenish color right here, like we showed before, complemented with the shading that goes all the way up to here, which is more of a desaturated and much darker shade of like yellowish green. You see that? See how it flips? It's almost a 90-degree change from there to there. And you should also note how bright it is. Right here it's bright, but it's also leaning more towards being colorful. This one's much darker and leaning much closer towards being pure gray. But of course I don't ever really mess with like pure gray, white, or black, because you can't easily change its hue if you need to do something subtle. Now that red stayed the same. this blue over here, again, a little bit more towards the greenish side, and then right here, bang, it goes all the way down to just about the darker, almost more purpley range of the blue, but not all the way there. Because once you get it, if you made it all the way here to this point, that sort of blue, and you, let me see, where is it? And you went over it like that, it would be too striking. See, that's like, this form of contrast is just gutting the entire thing. It's cutting through it like a fucking serrated knife. And to the untrained eye, if you look in between, if you squint your eyes like really hard, really blur them, you can't see the difference between that blue and that blue. But the subconscious details always stick out. So in this case, I'm doing something complementary in the range of how dark it is and how saturated it is versus which part of the color wheel it's on, because of course certain complementary colors are on opposite ends of color wheels, but this one, if you keep it within a close enough pitch and proximity, you can make something that that looks correct, I would say. And definitely never do this sort of thing where like I pick this color and then for the next shaded color I just go down and I just shade it like that or whatever. I mean, that it's too flat because it's on the same realm. It's always best to actually literally move this part of the color wheel along with wherever you're moving this part. So that's how you keep it dynamic. Everything actually has some kind of your placement on the color wheel shows a little bit of articulation, I would say. And same thing with the skin right here. You have something more on the yellow side and then something more on like the redder but a little bit desaturated side right there. But a lot of this again was just based on doing more dramatic lighting, with this really, really incredibly like to the limit bright red, and that's sort of what I want it to pop out because the eye also complements that, and the like this splatter of blood as well. It was all supposed to like stand out, kind of like a fucking, I don't know, like Sin City sort of thing, I thought that just looked a little bit more intimidating. But with the shading choice right here, let me see. Yeah, so this one is incredibly slight. It sort of contradicts what I was saying before, but it's a very, very slight difference. With certain colors, it can take its toll if you try to shift its shade color from the base one too much. But that one very ever so slightly comes down towards pink instead of being towards like more true red right over there. For this one, a bit more pink, a little bit pinker, and a lot darker. So that's how I was able to achieve that. And then you have these right here. This one's a bit interesting with the bag. This is sort of like, what do you consider this? This is sort of like a rosy, sandy brown, almost like a wooden sort of sandy, sort of like a cherry wood sort of brown. This right here is just mostly desaturated and still within like the rosier area, but I wanted to convey it as like a cooler color. So you still have a warmer color that's in this realm being complemented by a cooler color right here, which again can set like context for, let me see here. It can set context for how the overall color is supposed to look in your mind's eye, basically. Because all of this, because we look between the base color and the shaded, these are like two completely different realms. These are like two different creatures right there, entirely. This base palette is more or less full of potential. Whenever I was going through dealing with the change of the base palette, it didn't shift nearly as much as the shading, because the shading does moreover dictate how everything's going to look in the end. So the shading, the base color you almost never have to worry about too much, but the shading is actually where the real bit of like rendering actually matters and how it eludes the mind to whatever tone you're conveying, right? So with that in mind, I can kind of speed through the rest of these because that was basically that was the fundamentals. That was just the thing I always go with is typically just like the base color will generally, or at least for what I usually draw, but the base color is usually more a warmer and brighter palette, and the shading is going to be a cooler and darker palette. Cooler, darker, but also less saturated. So again, this stuff like this right here. This isn't like a true white, but it's clearly greener. That's just this is brighter and it's more saturated. This one is darker, less saturated, and also somewhere else on the color wheel. Now this technically was like a cooler color than this one, but with something like this, and of course with the hair, something a bit warmer, and then much cooler, much darker, and desaturated is usually what I like to go for in this sort of dramatic lighting. Now, there's another road you can take with this, where I have the skin might be a little bit hard to tell, but the skin color is actually less saturated, a little bit less saturated than I would normally have it with this. Let me see if I'm actually correct about that, because I go right here and I go back. Now you gotta pay really close attention to this little dot right here. I'm gonna go back to this, and you notice how there's a higher saturation for the shading over here. The shading right there is much more saturated than it was in this version of it. It was much more. It was much darker. But the skin, the base color for it. Now look where it is right now. It's more of a. It's a little bit like orange, light orange or so. Really, really light orange. I go over here and take a look at this little guy right here. I do that, and I do this. So it's very, very insanely slightly desaturated, but it doesn't come off that way only because I have this color is like much peachier. So this is where I basically reverse the concept, whereas before the base color was more saturated, and the shading was going to be less. The shading was going to be less saturated. The base color was being more saturated. This is when I reversed it, where the base color was actually less saturated and the shading was much more saturated than before. So you have something like this. Just keep your eye on the birdie right there, and I change back to this, and you see that the little dot went all the way back up towards the higher saturated area, and it was a much more closer tint to green. But just because you had the optical illusion of having this color be much more saturated than before, and give more credence to more that there was more like ambient lighting is what you would say. I'm not sure. Like the type of whenever the shading has more color, it makes it seem like it's more of it's a much brighter, more optimistic sort of color palette going on there. And this red, where I had it completely saturated, I made it damn near pale. But it's completely it's carried. It doesn't look dull because this is insanely dull compared to what it was, which was way up here, which was basically this color. This is just clinically dead. But I carry it back to life with the context of it being the shading, because the shading, whenever you shade something, it shows a secondary nature to the object or whatever that you're showing off here. Like it gives there's something more like vital about it, right? Like this, like even the contrast of the shadow to the shadow. This shadow's like far darker than the shadow of the skin. The shadow of the skin seems to damn near be glowing, but there's a radiance to the skin because it's a living part of the body, as opposed to parts that are non-living wouldn't be as radiant, which is also something you want to keep in mind. But that's, it's more of an advanced sort of like, not really advanced. That's just like another step above trying to give some kind of like context or credence to however you're coloring something. Now this was a bit of a doozy because you see where this is like desert sort of like cargo brown, and this is in an entirely different hemisphere. You see that? You see where this part of the color wheel is versus way the fuck over here. It's literally completely opposite. And this is a very sharp, very striking difference in color, but it almost acts in the same way that like a sudden change in color in like a sunset or a sunrise would. So it gives, you still retain a lot of vibrancy, and despite the fact that they're not, these two colors are not part of the same color family whatsoever, but it creates this sense of like composite between them, which is essentially all that matters. And of course over here you have this much more gray, and this is way more saturated, way darker, way bluer. So you kind of have like a contrast between something that, when something's gray, it also looks a little bit greener. It also looks somewhat warmer. It's difficult to describe, but it's much easier to demonstrate to yourself. Now, also with this, the metal right here, the metal like the saw right there, this is like cyan blue. This is just this is a like a summer sky. This is a really brilliant sort of like sky blue next to just a gunmetal gray. And those two combined right here in whatever salty, whatever kind of fucking voodoo magic, it works perfectly. It works properly for whatever the job it's supposed to have, because it's something that's metallic. It's something that would reflect light a lot more brilliantly and more strikingly in certain areas than it would in shadow. Be more accustomed to absorb the dark like a sponge. Now, again, this was the more, and even for this, okay, yeah, let me get back to this, because this area with the eyeshadow and the highlight right there. Now, if you're paying attention to the other ones, you see that this was clearly brighter, more saturated than this area, but that, again, I desaturated it all the way down to this point, which is actually a very dark color for something to indicate a highlight. But because its color value is still lighter than this color value, despite being less saturated, so therefore less, anything that illuminates or emits some kind of light, you would imagine would also have some sort of saturation, because it's a more stronger, more brilliant, more vibrant, more sort of it's much fruitier sort of like color, right? But this is just a practice of understanding the contrast between saturation levels between two colors and just the color value. The color value is how bright the color overall is, despite how much color is there. So this color is just brighter than this other one. Despite it being more saturated, this is still more saturated and darker than this one. So in composite, it does seem to have, it doesn't pop out immediately whenever you're looking at it from a distance, but it has enough subconscious influence. It has enough like just tiny influence for your mind to be fooled into seeing it in a way that, oh yeah, the rounder, more apexed part of the eyelid is brighter right there. As subtle as it is, and the color of it that is there does complement the colors that are surrounding the eye for the most part, like the blueness of the hair. So you always have to keep in mind of like just the environmental sort of afterglows of everything. Now, this next one is going to be very summer looking, because now everything is entirely saturated like that. This is blown out, but it's still a valid way to color things, really. So it's the same, it was essentially the same drawing, it was the same color palette and everything. It was just everything was blown to utter fucking Fruit of the Loom shit with all the color I could possibly manage with it. Even the line art got a lot more color in that exchange. But there's not too much to cover on that one. This is just what it looks like when everything's purely saturated. But again, it doesn't break the rules as much. Those still have some kind of a dynamic going on with its brightness and contrast and saturation and all this. Same with this. Now they're all generally well saturated, but they follow the proper guidelines of what I described earlier. Now, the last one is probably the most zombified, because this is darker than this is the darkest one that I came up with right there. Now this it looks, I fucking love how it looks. It's diabolical, and any part that's meant to be bright is as bright as it possibly could be. Everything else, this is where I made sure that the shading was as desaturated and as dark as I could possibly make it, comfortably make it. So you have this base color, which did change from the original. This was more of a cyan blue before. Oh god, let me go all the way back down. So this was the original thing that I ended up with. So it was more of this sort of blue before. Now it's that sort of blue. It's a darker blue. So I mean, I didn't make the contrast too crazy with making it incredible, like a much brighter color. Like a brighter color value of this would just be to go up to here. Because, like, between this area, the turquoise, and, like, the yellow area is, like, the brightest colors on the color wheel. But I toned it down just a little bit just because this was going to go way fucking down. And that enters basically the realm that is pretty much purple or violet. And I took it all the way towards this quadrant. And you see that with most of these, they end up in the much more desaturated quarter or quadrant of the color wheel here, or I guess the color square of the color wheel. You see that? All of them are consistently within that arena, I guess, except for that red a little bit, but everything else in a more saturated area, much more saturated. This much more saturated. Everything else is basically touching the tippy top of saturation. But I decided to make this, I mean, even with this sort of like red right here that was more violet before. You see that? But I decided for this one, because it was going to be more dramatic, it would actually be more of a true red. So everything here does its job properly. All of it, all the colors that are like adjacent to one another, like this I mean, this area, this cross right here on the leg, that is almost pure gray in contrast to this absolute red. And despite it works so perfectly well together. That's pushing the dynamics of the color and the dynamics of just shading in general to its absolute fucking limit. And let me see here. Let me go in and like get rid of these boxes, because I'm going to show how everything looks with the background back in place. Because overall, there's no point in doing all of this if it doesn't mesh well with the background that you established, right? So let me put that the fuck away. Hey, fuck away. Okay. So now we're back to the original right here, and I got this back. Now, of course, again, in contrast with everything, this was the base color. Very, very brilliant, very bright, but for the most part, this almost never changed the entire time. The only thing that really changed was the shading and was the overall nature, almost seasonal kind of nature of the shading. So this is what I ended up with originally. This is the brighter one, where the shading is more highly saturated and the base color is going to be less saturated but brighter. This is where it's all completely saturated, and you see how like just look at how, like, because there's a range of color going on in the background that I was able to do so many things that could still properly complement everything as an entire piece and still keep the focal point, the character, individualized throughout it all. So, hold on, there we go. So, this methodology, the base color, saturated and bright, and the shading was going to be somewhat less saturated. This one, opposite of that, the shading was super saturated, and then it got balanced out by making sure that the base color was less saturated, but it was still bright. And this one was just completely saturated all the way around, and it still more or less matches the background that you're seeing, like between the background and everything. I mean, if you imagine that there's like another light source that's above the character or whatever, but it's still, for the most part, it fits more or less. And then this much more dramatic lighting, which I think fits the absolute best, and I kind of regret not going with this one overall, but yeah, hindsight's 2020. It's a bitch. Fuck it. This one, complete the base color is regularly saturated, a bit more. What did I really do with it? I'd say it was a bit more on the warmer side somewhat. It was probably toned down a little bit, but the shading was as desaturated as possible and incredibly dark. So, those are your 4 seasons right there. What do I even consider that? What? This is like, that's like dead winter. This is summer. That one, I'll give you spring. That's like autumn. It's a bit easier going. So yeah, there you have it. That's how my brain works when I think about shading. Shit. Yeah. Also, I forgot to mention, there's people who like to shade things by like creating like another masking layer and then just selecting one color, like a periwinkle or some shit, and then just going over the whole character and then just hitting multiply. That's fine. That's good. Because you can then, mess around with the saturation of that. Also, for that, never go straight gray for anything. Never go straight gray for anything. Never go uncolored for fucking anything. Go use somewhat of a use a very liberal political. Okay, never. Jesus fuck. Yeah, so just always keep color in mind with everything. Just keep everything colorful so that you have something to dance with there, so you have something that could potentially react with the color that you have as a base. If you're going to do like a multiplication layer or something, like always have some kind of color that's there that can like react with the colors that you already have, so that it then reflects something about the environment that you have that has some kind of color to it. Or even if you don't have an environment there, you don't have a background, just having shading that has color to it does allude to more, and it does just liven things up. However, I did just say that was fine, but as someone who used to do that, it kind of sucks. It's not very versatile is the thing. There's certain ways that it might complement, like say if your character has like clothes on that the multiplication layer adds something like, oh my god, that looks amazing, but it does something fucky with the skin or the eyes or something like that, or the hair, and then you have to like throw that out and try to find some kind of compromise that doesn't exist, that doesn't really work in your mind because you found what you actually wanted. You just were more or less too lazy to put the other layers that where they needed to be to give them their own sense of color there. Another form of shading is also utilizing, I guess, the individual freedom that you have with different layers and different parts of the body. Like, those could, like, the skin could be shaded with something that's very... I guess this would help if I fucking showed off a more clear example of this. The skin right here could be shaded with something more pinkish, but the hair would be shaded with something more bluish. in this case, that's what I did because the hair was blue. But had I, well, if you look at all the shading of the clothing versus the skin, which does complement each other, but the clothing here is all colored blue, including the hair. This is all, like, if I decided to do a multiplication layer, like, I keep saying multiplication, like multiplication fucking table. Anyways, if I used a multiply layer, and I used like sort of like a light blue or whatever, that's just about the result I would have come up with consistently between the shirt here, the bag, the fucking everything. The only exception would have been the skin. The skin shading would have had to conform to how blue everything else was as well. But it's much more lively having the individual choice to sort of sectionally give everything its own color, to give everything its own individual flair and pop, just to sort of kind of rainbow the whole thing, make it as gay as possible. So yeah, that was the part I had to add in. Yeah, now go back to your gay little drawings, gay boy. Fuck you.